In competitive shooters like Counter-Strike, aim is incredibly important. I mean, you do need to be aiming at your enemies in order to kill them. That's why aim training programs have become quite popular, most notably being AimLabs. But it also raises an interesting question. Does AimLabs actually help you perform better in matches or not? Now, I wanted to do this by the books, so I got a spreadsheet of all my Counter-Strike matches. So join me on an adventure with some pretty graphs as we get to the bottom of this question. Now first, some disclaimers, and I'm putting them at the start of the video instead of the end in order to make sure people actually hear this and aren't misconstruing some of the points. First, yes, I do have data on all of my matches, emphasis on mine. I don't have other players' matches, so I cannot make any conclusions about if AimLabs does help for other people. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I don't have the data currently to answer that question, only if AimLabs helps me. And second, I do think using AimLabs over time would help as well. Consider basketball. If you practice shooting three-pointers, then come game day, you'll be in a better position to hit a three-pointer. I know, it's mind-blowing. Who could have seen that practice makes perfect? So using AimLabs responsibly and not messing around on it should cause some help in your aiming over time. The question we're answering is, does using it before a match have any noticeable effect? And with that, let's get into some of the statistics by laying a game plan. Feel free to skip this section if you know 2 sample z-tests for differences in means. If you don't worry. I'll build up to the core concept so you'll understand it a bit.
So first, we need to address a problem. I have 2 groups, but these groups may not be on the same scale. Let's take the following example. You're applying to colleges and can only submit either the ACT or SAT, and obviously you want to submit whatever score is better. But these two have different scales, so how do you know which score actually is better? Some mathematician really long ago came up with the solution to our problem, z-scores. By taking the data point, in this case our ACT and SAT scores, subtracted by the mean, then dividing by the variance, which is just a fancy way of saying how spread out the data is, we get z-scores. These put everything onto a common scale and allow us to compare anything by just comparing which z-score is greater. Here's where we add in an extra step though, and the math starts to get a little technical. First, let's use ADR as the variable of interest, since I think it's a pretty good proxy for aiming ability. The z-score formula uses data for the population, and a very common problem is that we don't actually know the mean and variance of the population. We can estimate the mean with no problem from our sample, but we can't do the same for variance. We still need variance though, so we can substitute in the variance from the sample, but in order to show that we are using the sample variance rather than the population variance, we now get something called the t-test statistic, which is what we will be using. So we solved our first problem. ADR might not always be on the same scale between the warm-up and non-warm-up groups, but we're able to force them to the same scale. So we can just compare the values of t that we get for each one, right? Not yet. You see, we're also concerned with randomness. Consider bags of M&Ms, for example. You won't always get the same color from each sample. For example, I'll go and do one here, take out some M&Ms, and I got a lot of orange M&Ms here, but then I take another random sample, and suddenly I have a good amount of orange M&Ms, but they're dwarfed by all those blue M&Ms. That's just the way that randomness works. You're going to get different results each time. So instead, we should rephrase our question from, are they different, to are they more different than what we would expect? Are they more different than what randomness would allow? And how do we calculate something like this? Well, what about finding the probability that we get the results we see? If we assume something like there's no difference between warming up and not warming up, what is the probability that we get these results? And if the probability is too small, we say that it isn't just randomness that is behind our results, but something else. Hey guys, hardware for the future here. I realized while making this that I forgot an important step here. We have to randomize which group each one goes in. So I'll flip a coin before playing a match. If it's heads, I'll warm up using AimLabs. If it's tails, I won't. This helps me make the causation statement that we want later. So how do we calculate this probability? Well, there is a long way to go about it. The t-statistic that we found earlier have a function associated with them, and astute viewers might be able to piece together that if we integrate the function, we would get the probability, since the function just gives probabilities at a single point and we're adding all those points together. However, that function is a pain, so we don't really want to go about doing that. Instead, let's use the magic of computers. Someone real long ago wrote a program to do that integral for us, so instead, I'm going to have the computer do all the hard math for us. So here I have RStudio open. RStudio is a interface for R, which is a programming language that's very helpful for statistics. There's a whole lot going on here, but what we need to focus on is this right here. Specifically, this line. So this first one is going to be that t-test statistic that I was talking about a little while ago, and this p-value is going to be the probability I was talking about a few seconds ago. Now typically the probability would range from 0 to 1, and here this is saying, okay, assuming that there is no difference, there's a 92% chance of getting the results we got. And so usually you would reject that null hypothesis. You would reject the claim that there is no difference if our probability was less than 5%. Since this is a lot larger than any reasonable cutoff, we would say, okay, we don't have the evidence to claim that there is a difference. And if you look right here, you can see, okay, X is using no AimLabs, Y is using AimLabs. There's only about a 0.3 ADR difference, which is not a lot. And once again, we can do the same thing with headshot percentage. If we go here, once again, there's our test statistic we were talking about, and here's our p-value. Once again, the p-value is pretty small, but it's not small enough to give any convincing evidence that there is a difference. And once again, we look here, that's not much of a difference in headshot percentage. However, here's where I have to make a confession. I lied. We don't have to do any of this. Let me explain. So the previous test we just did is one of many statistical tests, and statistics is great for when you have a sample and want to make some statement about the population. But what if we already have the entire population? For example, what if we already have data on
all my Counter-Strike matches?
Well, then we don't need statistics. We can just go straight to basic math. For example, we want to know whether there's a difference in ADR between the groups. We can just go straight to comparing them. No statistics needed. So because I've set up the experiment correctly and there is in fact a difference, we can conclude yes, using AimLabs actually makes you play a little bit worse here with both ADR and headshot percentage. You can see it's lower. But this is where we bring up the second part. They're so close together that while they are different, is it actually significant? Not really. I doubt that this is going to be the difference that makes or breaks a game. So why talk about all of that statistics if we don't actually need to do it then? Well, several reasons. First off, some small reasons. I enjoy rambling about statistics, and having a captive audience is one of the best things. And perhaps someone else out there will want to do a similar experiment, and they should give them some good pointers for how to go about doing that. And I also had a feeling that if I didn't talk about all of this, someone in the comments would say, technically. But finally, the main reason. I'm a math tutor at my local university, and a common mistake I see people do in mathematics is just jump right in and throw numbers together without thinking. It's a common pitfall in mathematics, and I was even doing it while making this video. So it was more so as a caution and letting me make this statement about pausing and assessing the situation instead of jumping right in, because usually there's some easier ways about doing things. Problem solving, am I right? It wouldn't be a proper experiment if we didn't also take some time to reflect and ponder why we got the results we did. And as for why I think there's no significant difference between using AimLabs and not, I can think of two reasons. I'm not at a skill level where aim is critical, but rather plain smart, and also that AimLabs, while robust, doesn't train specifically for Counter-Strike. Starting with the second point, which is the easier of the two, I found that AimLabs does rigorously train every part of your crosshair, but it doesn't exactly train movement. Counter-strafing, something that's critical in Counter-Strike, for example, doesn't quite exist in AimLabs. Sure, you can practice swinging into angles on AimLabs, but the mechanics of AimLabs are different from CS, which is not the best if you want to be practicing your CS skills. The first point is very similar. Once again, AimLabs only practices crosshair skills, but it does not practice game sense, which is just as, if not even more important to winning rounds. And game sense is a hard thing to train. It requires playing the game a ton and getting used how you want to play the game. Unfortunately, AimLabs will never be able to substitute that, which is why I also think there's a minimal difference.
An obvious follow-up question would be, well, how am I supposed to practice? And to answer this, I would like to draw again on my tutoring experience. A common question I get is, how do I study for tests, or quizzes, or exams? And I always respond, study what you don't know. A similar principle applies to Counter-Strike. Practice your weaknesses. The best way to find out your weaknesses, review your games and see what some of your downfalls are. Ask some friends and see what they think. See what your weak points are and focus on improving them, just like you'd study for a test. Finally, this video is done. It took me like 2 years to make it because I'm lazy as heck. And I'd like to thank a couple of people as well for making this video different ways. So you'll see a couple names pop up on screen, along with their socials if they wanted them, and or funny or memorable quotes, because I like funny and memorable quotes. This is also the part of the video where I'd say to like and subscribe, which I do encourage. I've got some statistics videos and data projects in the works that people might find interesting, and also comment as well because, well, maybe you have other questions that you want answered, or any comments about what went on in this video. Until then though, be well.